Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of one of our Learn Free videos on YouTube. Today, we are very honored to be with Dr. Brain Ray from NHERI, leading home education research institute, which I'll maybe ask you a little bit about, Dr. Ray. But and I also want to thank you for being here today, because you're basically in the process of getting all the last things done and packing to come to fly to Africa to attend the Pamoja conference in Kenya. So I know we're catching you with kind of one hand on the suitcase, the other hand on the PCR test, and looking for a passport somewhere in the background.
Yes, thank you. It's good. Thank you, Christopher.
Maybe so. Just to start, tell us a little bit about NHERI, where it comes from, what its background is, and then we'll maybe get into your background and how you became interested in home education research.
All right. Well, the Research Institute, NHERI, National Home Education Research Institute, is now, Christopher, 33 years old. 33 years. And let me let people know, 5 years before that, so 38 years ago, I started a journal called Homeschool Researcher. So that gives you a little sense of the timeline here. How did it happen? I don't know. It's like the sovereign, there's providence. But I've loved animals and science ever since I was a little boy. So I was a pure science guy, bachelor's degree in biology, master's science in zoology, studying pack rats. But I've also always liked teaching and education and children. So eventually my PhD was in science education. And also at the same time, I'm a little bit of a conservative hippie. I've always been interested in what works, alternatives. And way back time machine, I met some people who were, I didn't even know it. They were basically homeschooling their children in Corvallis, Oregon, USA. And I started looking into research. There was almost none. So I started pulling it together. Therefore, you get the Homeschool Researcher Journal, and in 1990, you get the National Home Education Research Institute. And we've been doing research on collecting research, collating research, analyzing research by many others, and doing it ourselves now for over 35 years. That's how you got NHERI, and our name and the internet gets us all over the world.
And what we'll do is we'll actually include some of those links into the description of the video. And you're essentially, I mean, one of the reasons we're so honored to have you is you're essentially the pioneer of home education research, as you described, in the US, going back 30 years, which is really where, I wouldn't say it began there, but possibly one of the points at which it was growing. And I know that if you go and look into the academic research, always you find the name Brain Ray. What motivated you specifically to really become involved in researching home education in itself?
Well, there are a couple of things. One, I'm just curious. I'm just curious, and I want to know how people learn and what happens. And I don't know why. I question the norm. I want to know institutional schooling. Now, wait a minute. What did we have historically? And I had to learn a lot of this on my own, Christopher. I did not get this from my professors, not even in my PhD studies. And a philosophy of education makes you start to ask questions about the fundamental elements of life, epistemology and axiology and metaphysics. And I started looking at schooling and thinking, well, I went to schools, I went to institutional schools all my life, but is it necessarily the best way for children to learn? And then I realized, wait a minute, for thousands of years, parent-directed home-based education was the norm, and institutional schools, like most of us know today, for the last 120 years, was not the norm. And from parent-directed home-based education, not only with mommy and daddy, not only with mom and dad, but with parent-led and based at home, but with mentors and people who are good at things. We have great art. Throughout history, we have great literature. We have pyramids. We have regular people who run businesses, bakers and candlestick makers, and we have people who do all kinds of things, businesses and traders, all without institutional schooling. So if that's true, why do we have institutional schools today? And as you said, we have this modern homeschool movement, that broke out again about 40 or more years ago in the United States and some other places. And now we now have at least a 40-year experiment saying, did home-based education work hundreds and thousands of years ago? And does it work today? And do we have any evidence that it works? Well, obviously from history, we have evidence that it worked, because in the United States of America, institutional schooling was not the norm until about 1900. That's what I'm so curious.
Okay, that's very interesting, and that leads me really into the question, which is so academically, how are homeschoolers doing? What does the research tell us in terms of, because I think you could also make the argument that perhaps 500 or 600 years ago, the average person didn't receive the kind of education they do today. So how are home educators, if you compare them to people who are in institutional education, how do homeschoolers, how do home educators fare? What's the results of the research into the kind of academic performance of homeschoolers?
Okay, and before I get to that, I want to remind people, when we say people didn't get the same education 500 years ago, which people? Some people got a better education than many Americans get today. I got to really make that point. We have these assumptions about the past. But again, remember, all the great literature, all the businesses, all the inventions, all those things hundreds of years ago. All right, so now let's just flash forward. If we want to measure things by the standards of normative institutional schooling, this is what's very fascinating. Home educated children, even though they do not have to follow the norms of institutional schools, they are outperforming on average the children who go to institutional schools. We have over 30 years of research now, and when you look at academic achievement, 78% of the studies in peer-reviewed journals show the home educated are doing significantly better than those in institutional schools, which is shocking a lot of people, because the vast majority of these parents do not have teacher certifications. The vast majority of the parents are not trained in education. On average, they are relatively median income. And in fact, the homeschool community is starting to have a little bit lower income. The parents have maybe about the same, maybe a little more formal education than other parents, but not much. And yet their children are doing better than the children in institutional schools with state certified teachers, government certified teachers, and over $15,000 per year, for example, in the United States. The home educated children are doing better academically.
So I think that people then say, well, perhaps home education is better academically, but they'll say home educated learners are social freaks. They don't fit into society, and so they and the argument then is that, well, they may be okay academically, but are they really socially, or should I say, are they socially well adjusted?
Sure.
Is there research on that, and what does the research tell us?
Yeah, the research tells us, first I have to make a philosophical statement, Christopher, I'm going to do that. Whenever somebody asks about what about their social and emotional development, you have to ask, what is the standard? If the standard is the average kid in public school, that might not be the standard you want, because maybe they're not doing great socially and emotionally. And in fact, in the last few years, there's more depression and suicidal ideation. So let's just keep that in mind. Now, to answer your question directly, again, over 30 years of research on the social and emotional development of children, get this, 87% of studies in peer-reviewed journals show the homeschooled children are doing statistically significantly better than those in institutional schools in terms of their social, emotional, and psychological development. Pretty simple.
It's a very interesting that's very interesting research, and I think you bring up the point that one of the reasons many learners come into homeschooling or home education is because of social and emotional problems in schools. I think that it seems that the debate's kind of shifted over the years. So kind of the debate started out historically, which said people could almost not believe that it would be possible for children in a homeschooling environment to perform academically. Then they kind of couldn't believe that you could be at home and be equally or better socially adjusted than someone who was interacting with their peers for the whole day, every day kind of thing.
Right.
And then recently what's emerged is the issue of questions about abuse and are learners not being kept, or children not being kept at home and then being subject to abuse. Has there been research on that? I know that became quite controversial in the States a year or two ago.
Yes, yeah. So it's fascinating. First of all, the philosophical response, Christopher, it's sort of strange over the years. You know, most regular citizens think, oh, schools are for teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic, right? You know, it's like it's supposed to be for academics. And now some people have started to make the argument, well, actually, public schools are supposed to be a police force to make sure that maybe parents are not doing bad things to their children. Well, that's a strange twist of events in history. Now, to answer your question directly, yes, there's a little bit of research now, and a colleague of mine and I got to do the big one, just came out within the last year, and there was a little bit before that. But we asked the question, what is the rate of child abuse and neglect for children who were in institutional schools, whether public or private, compared to those who were homeschooled? And there are two key findings. The first key finding is that when you take into account demographics such as parent education level, household income, years that the children have been in foster care, ethnicity or race, when you take into account those statistically, then between those who are in institutional schools and those who are homeschooled, no statistical difference in terms of their experience of abuse and neglect. So that's the first big finding, no difference. Second big finding, which is, I would say, just as important, if not a little bit more, for the not significantly more abuse or neglect experienced by the homeschooled, what abuse and neglect was not happening at home by the family. It was happening outside of the home by other perpetrators. So, two findings, no significant difference overall. And for that which was happening for the homeschooled, it was happening statistically outside the home, not in the home. So at this point, there's that's the major study so far. Other studies have shown basically no difference to slightly more harm to children who are in institutional schools.
Thanks. That's also, that's quite an interesting finding. And I think that so if you kind of review the research, the development of the research over these 30 to 40 years, we go through these kind of phases. And so essentially you can, to some extent, say homeschoolers are well educated academically, they're well adjusted socially, they're not at a greater risk. The question then that seems to be emerging, and perhaps being driven by the fact that a lot more people are opting for homeschooling, is what is homeschooling something that is then only for the elite? Is it something that only works for people from higher socioeconomic status? No. I know that this is an emerging area, but is there research in that area, and what are your findings, or what are your feelings about that?
There is research on that, and it's to me it's fascinating philosophically that especially some professors and academics in America have tried to promote the stereotype that homeschooling families are white and wealthy and the parents are very highly educated. It's never been true that they're way more highly educated. It's never been true that they're wealthy. For a while in the United States, they were disproportionately white Anglo, which would be, our majority here. But the research now shows clearly that they're very average people. I mean, on average, they're average people. In fact, they're probably a little bit lower median income. Education level of parents is about the same, maybe a touch higher, not much, than the national average. And minorities here, ethnic minorities, have been flocking to homeschooling. Black families, African-American families, Hispanic are flocking to homeschooling because they're seeing the advantages of that compared to institutional schooling. And the research from our federal government suggests that the household income of homeschooling families is actually dropping and is a little bit lower than average but the children, in spite of those demographics, are doing better than those in public schools.
Very interesting, and yeah, and that's actually a very interesting challenge, and something quite relates to South Africa's situation.
In fact, Christopher, I got another comment on that. This research reminds me of what came out of the United Kingdom about almost 40 years ago, and I'm wondering if this is going to happen. I hypothesize that, in a sense, home-based education is disproportionately better for families of lower socioeconomic status than it is for others, because they're getting advantages in a home-based education environment that they could never get in public schools. So I think maybe we're going to see an even greater advantage. In fact, I found that I did the first quantitative study of the homeschooling in African American families, and their children were much more benefited by homeschooling than what's happening in public schools for them in America.
So in South Africa as a country which is a developing country, could then benefit from home education in terms of what you're talking about, and I think that's actually very similar to the South African experience that we're seeing particularly families who are perhaps slightly better educated than the average, but perhaps not economically better off than the average, opting for homeschooling because it's a way in which they get a better quality education for their children than they can otherwise. Now, you're coming out to Africa to share some of this research again at the Pamoja conference. But I think you're aware that, and the conference is also looking at this issue, that we've got a basic education laws amendment bill in South Africa that's going to make some quite radical changes to the homeschooling environment here. You've had a chance to have a bit of a look about the bill, and I'd like to just, as we start moving or wrapping up our conversation, I'd like to get some insights from you about how you see research interacting with regulation, and what advice you can give us in South Africa so that we don't kind of go and reinvent the wheel in terms of kind of putting in all sorts of interventions that perhaps are not necessary. Now, I mentioned this to you slightly earlier, and you were quite positive about this. We had so I think what I want to maybe just address first is the issue of the importance of research when regulations are being made. We had a consultant, the Department of Basic Education in South Africa, one of their own consultants, Dr. Trevor Coombe, reviewed home education in 2015, the state of home education in South Africa. And I'm going to give you a quote and get your comment. He said, "A comprehensive understanding of the home education phenomenon in South Africa can be achieved only after an independent research study has been carried out on the basis of a research design in which both the department and the home education bodies have confidence, and until reliable information is available, the development of a new home education policy and amendments to home education law should be approached with due circumspection." As a researcher, what's your response to that comment?
That's an excellent opinion from him. Excellent, because otherwise, what you will have is a constant battle of philosophies and worldviews. And let's face it, we all come from some kind of worldview. And one worldview is, if we could only control people more, then they'll do things more like we want them to do. And another worldview is, if you could just leave the people alone by the government, they'll do fine on their own. And this battle goes on and on and on and on, and there's no resolution. But if you have some facts and figures and statistics, it helps people to make sane and thoughtful policy. And I'll give people a little bit of a hint. We had the same argument for 30 years in America, that some would say, if only the state, the government, could control homeschoolers more, the children will learn more. Now, you can guess that argument came mostly from teachers' unions and professors of education who make their living off of teachers and teachers' unions, and others said, this leave them alone. Here's what the research shows us so far. And we are like an experiment in the United States for the whole world, because we have 51 different laws related to education, including homeschooling. 51 different laws, all the way from a few that are very controlling of families, private home education, and others have no control over private home education. And the research, voila, shows this: no statistical correlation between the degree of government control of homeschooling and how well the children are doing academically. Zero correlation. So I think what we see from this, Christopher, is that there's something about home-based education that ameliorates many, many things that happen in public schools and allows children to thrive in a way they could not otherwise. But that's a little more speculation. I just want to give you that. That's a great idea about research. You shouldn't try to control people before you know that some kind of control is necessary when it comes to education, because one of the beauties, and most, actually, this is what's interesting, most professors of education, most professional educators with state licenses, they know, they dream of freedom in education, customizing the education and individualize the education for each child. They know that's what's best. So when they start promoting laws that control homeschooling, they're fighting against that.
And I think that's a concern of a lot of parents, and it's certainly a concern that's been addressed, because a lot of parents in South Africa have withdrawn their kids from the public schooling system, or even the independent schooling system, which is very expensive in South Africa, and in most cases, and they've brought their children into a home education to get them out of a standardized curriculum and assessment. From your research, and perhaps this was probably as we move towards the end, a sort of wrap-up question, what do you see the impact of standardized curriculum and standardized assessment? Is that really pedagogically valuable? Is that where the thinking in? I think because probably you've answered it to a certain extent, but is that where the thinking, or what the goal is for education? Where do we want to be in the future? Do we want do we really want more of this kind of controlled curriculum, more testing, and what is the impact that has on learning?
Yes. Let me go back to I'll just quickly repeat what I said. I know in some nations, including the United States, that if a child is considered, the terms change all the time, but special needs, learning disabled, talented and gifted, whatever it is, quite a ways away from the norm, what do? We give them what's called an IEP, individualized education program or plan, because educators know the best way to help any child achieve his or her potential most is to individualize and customize the pedagogical approach in the curriculum. Everybody knows that. You talk with people, they know overall that's the best thing for children. So nationally normed tests and national standards for all children that are the same is antithetical to that, and does not take into consideration what we know from pedagogical theory is the best for each child. So more control, more regulation over private education like homeschooling is fighting against what is best for the children and for the nation. Secondly, more and more controls like this are especially burdensome for vulnerable communities, or communities of people who already have challenges in accessing a variety of things. So more and more control is harder and harder on the people who most possibly need the freedom to choose the best thing for their children.
Right. Let me maybe ask this last question then. As a researcher, if you were to advise our policymakers, our parliamentarians, what is the kind of regulation, or what is the kind of law that you would advise that they and I know you don't like writing law for the regulation of home education, but what are some of, maybe I should ask you, what are some of the principles that you would include in a fair and reasonable home education regulation environment?
Right. Yeah. If I had to be not philosophical, and I had to be more just try to be a secular, balanced person, I would have to say that if there's going to be control and regulation of private home education. By the way, in the United States, there is not, in many of the states, there is no control. I just want people to realize that. And these children are doing great. They're doing above average without government controls. Now, if there had to be government control, then you need to be very, very fair and balanced. So, the wording could be something like that they're providing an education that is adequate compared to a typical public school education. That's the only thing that's fair. You should not have more control or less control, for example, over test scores. In the United States, we have a couple of states that say, well, the child must score at this percentile point. It's totally unfair. Public school students do not have to score at that percentile or above. So if you just said something like an adequate education compared to what might be offered in a public school system, that's about it. In public schools, by the way, in a public school, I'm guessing in your country that if a child is 15 percentile points below average, the state does not force him to be homeschooled or private schooled. They let him stay. They let him stay in that public school system.
Yeah.
So you have to
make a plan.
You have to be fair to all people.
Great, excellent, and I think important principles. It needs to be research based. It needs to be fair, and take lessons from the rest of the world, from what we see working in the rest of the world.
Let's do a quick thought experiment, Christopher. What if a very fair research project like this fellow suggested that was well designed? What if it found that home educated children on average did better than public school students? Then should the state start promoting homeschooling over the public school system? That's a fair question. Fair question. Okay, so yeah, research is very important. Research is very important to get solid, sound, and sane regulations.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dr. Ray. Thank you for your time. Enjoy your trip to Kenya. We hope all the travel challenges are surmounted, and in time we'd love to have you back on our Learn Free YouTube channel and unpack some of these topics from us. But it's been an absolute pleasure to learn from you, and we really enjoy your time in Africa. And thank you very much. God bless. Go well. Have a lovely evening.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye. And thanks to everyone. As usual, subscribe, do all of the good YouTube things. Thank you very much. And thanks for watching. Goodbye.